Welcome to Digital Figure Sculpture with me, Scott Eaton. I will be your instructor for the next 10 weeks in this online course. And this is the first lecture in the series, and this is just a gentle introduction to digital figure sculpture. And I really wanted to take a few minutes before we get seriously involved in the course to give you guys a little perspective on where we fit in the history of art, and specifically where we fit in the continuum of figure sculpture. You know, where did this all begin? Way back when. And by way back when, I'm talking about 40,000 years ago. So if we go back to the early Paleolithic era, we're talking about this stuff, right? The very first instance of any figure sculpture ever found is this gal, shall we say. And it's a tiny little figurine, and it's categorized as a Venus figurine. And there are some of the earliest artifacts found that humans made in our own likeness. And typically, the Venus figurines are characterized by huge breasts and huge female genitalia. And this first one is an archetype of that. And there's others that kind of carry on throughout history. And here's another Venus figurine from 30,000 BC. Another one, this is one of the most famous, Venus of Wilsendorf, and she's from 24,000 BC, and all the way to present with my own Venus of Cupertino, which is 2010 AD, I suppose. And so that's where we fit in the broad spectrum of history from the very beginning to present. But there's a lot of stuff to fill in between, right? So we start kind of with pre-dynastic Egyptian culture, right? So as we move out of the tens of thousands of years BC, we get into kind of Egyptian culture. And they really started to do refine the figure, anyways, we'll say. So they kind of subtly conform their proportions to something more reasonable. But then they progress it in kind of to the archetype that we recognize as Egyptian sculpture, quite erect stances and very squared off shoulders. And so this is kind of going on at about 2500 BC. And if we kind of look across the Atlantic to Mesoamerican culture, so the Mayans and other pre-Columbian civilizations, we see that they haven't quite got caught up in the taste level. They're doing ornate sculptures of guys rogering each other. And so hopefully everybody will come around and we'll get some classical sculpture coming soon. And to get the classical stuff, we have to turn to the Greeks. So with the Greeks, we start to see some development of form, but this is very kind of early Greek, so archaic Greek, and it takes a lot of its form and influence from Egyptian kind of forms and styles. And we start to see actually some early evidence of the Egyptians kind of starting to identify landmarks and forms, right? So people who've been on the anatomy course recognize a lot of these things that that we've talked about, right? The costal arch and anterior superior iliac spines and the inguinal ligament down to the pubic symphysis. And so they start to actually know a few things and observe a few things and indicate these marks on their sculptures. Right? Look at this. This could actually be the iliotibial band coming down to the side of the knee, gastrocnemius and the soleus. And look at this. It may even know something about this little muscle in the back that we call the teres major. Right? So broadly speaking, they're starting to refine the way they represent the figure. And this as we move from kind of archaic Greece to classical Greece, that's where we start to see everything kind of come into place, right? So in classical Greece, we're looking at these kind of things that are from the Parthenon, right? So these are the Elgin marbles, which are in the British Museum. And that's when we start to see kind of the classical Greek proportions that Western sculpture has emulated for hundreds of years and thousands of years actually since, right? So the Greeks really came together The winged Nike in the Louvre is a great example of kind of the companion period to classical sculpture. So we had classical in Greece, and that was followed by Hellenistic, right? Which both of those, so classical kind of ended with the fall of Alexander the Great, and Hellenistic ended with the kind of Roman conquest of Greece, right? And this is kind of one of the archetypes of kind of high classical sculpture. And in fact, this wasn't even, this is not even, this is the Apollo Belvedere, and this is not even a real Greek statue. This is actually a Roman copy of what would be originally a Greek bronze, but it kind of captures the essence of everything, and it was emulated, this style, for thousands of years. And again, we started to see it with the neoclassical movement, which we'll talk about. Okay, so that brings us to Rome and the Roman time period. So what did the Romans do? Well, to be honest, the Romans mostly just copied Greek stuff. Right, so there was such an influence from the Greek cultures that we've just talked about to the Romans, that most of what survives today are of Roman artwork, for the most part, are Roman copies of Greek originals. So mostly the Greeks made bronzes, and most of the stuff that we see these days in Naples, here's a Hercules, and this is in the Vatican Museum in Rome. The Laocoon group, they're both copies of what would have been originally Greek bronzes, right? So that's the Roman period really quickly, and moving forward, because we're not going to dwell on my timeline of art history for too long, but it brings us to the Dark Ages. And what happens in the Dark Ages? Well, not much. But things did happen, and it sets us up for the Renaissance. But what happened? Pretty much the church took over, and there were a lot of sculptures and things made for cathedrals, Romanesque art and Gothic art, and it was all very stiff, and it's kind of things that they would use to hold up doorways in cathedrals. So we don't have any of that. But moving forward, we get to the stuff we've been waiting for, right? So bring on Michelangelo, bring on Bernini, and finally bring on Canova, a guy that hopefully some of you recognize. So this kind of takes us from Renaissance to Baroque, right here with Bernini. So David here and David here, two very different styles. Renaissance sculpture being very statuesque and very erect and balanced. Baroque injecting some dynamism into the stances and the poses, and trying to capture action in sculpture. And Baroque persisted for a few hundred years, so probably late 1500s until 1700s. And then what happened was a revival of the study of kind of classical stuff from Greece, right? Classical sculpture from Greece. And that's when we got the neoclassical period, which is very round, smooth forms, very, very kind of perfect in proportions. And without, just kind of full figures with kind of Greek-styled hair and everything, no matter where they were made. It was all emulating classical Greek, hence the term neoclassicism. Okay, so from there, where do we go? Well, neoclassicism dominated the French Academy from its inception, and that was the big thing. But eventually, neoclassicism got a little boring because everything was being made neoclassically, and there was a lot of criticism leveled against the Academy for being too staid in this tradition, and so they started to inject realism and naturalism into their figures. And so this is what we started to get out of the French Academy in the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s. So we got really, really beautiful figures, and people who've been on the anatomy course know that we study some of these for our écorché assignments because they knew their anatomy intrinsically and studied very, very hard, and it all translated into their work. So we're going to have a lot of that in this course, actually. We call this a figure sculpting course, but this is a figure sculpting and anatomy course because the two are inseparable. Okay, so we had naturalism coming back into sculpture and studying the figure and trying to keep the forms as real to life as we could. And here's another one of my favorites, which is Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. And this is Ugolino, and he is kind of immortalized in Dante's Inferno as a treasonous count who was locked in a tower with his two sons and his grandsons and left there to starve. And this is kind of the point where he goes mad and starts to consider eating his children. And so we'll see this again actually in a minute. So that's the Ugolino group. Okay, so with the French Academy, we had kind of a very dominant tradition, and it really dictated the taste in art for hundreds of years. And it got to the end of the 1800s, right? So nearly the turn of the 20th century. And we started to see things like Impressionism popping up and the avant-garde, which is people breaking out of this tradition of purely figurative representational arts. And kind of emerging in that scene, in that same sense, is the first modernist sculptor. And that is Auguste Rodin. And people recognize, obviously, the thinker. Almost one of the most iconic sculptures in the world. The thinker came from a bigger piece of his that was a commission from the French state called the Gates of Hell. It was never completed, and he never completed the commission. And it was eventually canceled because he dragged his heels for so long. But a number of pieces that he realized in full size were derived from small figure groups on the Gates of Hell. And in this one we have the thinker taking the centerpiece. And it was later enlarged to what we see on the left here. Another thing, if we look closely, and you're going to have to squint your eyes at the screen, this is a group called the Ugolino group, right? And this is Rodin's version of what we just looked at. And this is the father Ugolino and over his sons or his grandsons at the point of madness. Okay, so that's Rodin, and he was the first really to break with purely representational kind of French academic tradition. And it brings us to an interesting schism in figurative art at the turn of the 20th century. And what happened is a guy wanders into Rodin's studio named Brancusi, a Romanian sculptor, came to apprentice himself with Rodin. He had finished at the French Academy. He came around to Rodin's workshop and he was accepted in as an apprentice. But he soon left, realizing, and he says himself, that nothing can grow under a big tree. And so we had a schism that set up in art because Brancusi left believing that the future of sculpture was carving directly in stone, directly in the medium, as opposed to modeling in clay, modeling in plaster, and then casting and enlarging. So he was really about the direct manipulation of materials. And that led to kind of the rise of modernist sculpture. And there's an interesting parallel in the careers as they progressed of Rodin and Brancusi along these two separate paths. So we have kind of a little bit of a rivalry happening, Rodin versus Brancusi. They both created sculptures called the Kiss, right? So we're very familiar with Rodin's on the left. And Brancusi created one himself, which I'll show you. And again, he was about directly carving in stone. So this is what he came up with. Yes. Lost a bit in translation. But this is where modernist sculpture was headed at this time, right? And again, they both created a sculpture called the Danaide, which is a reference to a Greek story. And we recognize Rodin's on the left, and this is Brancusi's on the right. So abstraction is taking hold, and the representationalism in sculpture is on its way out as far as the art world is concerned. If I had to choose which one I prefer, I love the naturalism of the one on the left of Rodin's, but we won't be too hard on this one because it actually sold at auction in New York in 2002 for $18 million, one of the casts of this sculpture, from Brancusi. So there's strong collector taste for it. Okay, so where does that leave us, these two kind of along parallel tracks? Pretty much tit for tat through the first two sculptures, so final throwdown is Rodin versus Brancusi in beard growing. And this is really what it comes down to as a sculptor when you get old, is your ability to grow a big white beard. And so if I have to be the adjudicator for this contest, I've got to go with Rodin's beard. However, it's a little unruly down here. Could use a trim. Brancusi's is actually quite tidy and very modernist at the same time. So anyways, that brings us to the 20th century, and we're deeply engrossed in 20th century sculpture now. So what do we have? We have Henry Moore, we have Giacometti, and we have Picasso also doing sculpture, and we have a number of traditions, kind of schools of art coming in and out, and most of them are separating themselves from strongly figurative tradition. Okay, so that brings us to us, since we're in the 21st century now. So what are we going to do with all these tools? That's the big question mark. There's a big group of people that want to know about traditional figure sculpture and all the details that they used to know to create beautiful things, and we have fantastic tools to do it. So that's what this course is about, and this is where we're going to go.